I was slapped by my own son, the same son I had raised, the one I had fought for, loved, and sacrificed everything for. He stood in the living room, coldly telling me, "This isn't your home anymore, get out." The sting of his words hurt more than the slap itself. In that moment, I realized I had lost more than just a home, I had lost the family I thought would always stand by me. But what followed, what I quietly did next, changed everything. If you want to hear how this story unfolds, and how silence became my most powerful weapon, make sure to subscribe. Now, let me tell you how this journey truly began. Harriet's life had always been tied to the small, snow-covered town nestled in the hills, where winter lingered much longer than it ever should, and the skies hung heavy with gray. The snow, relentless and cold, had become a companion over the years. Harriet had seen it settle over her world like a blanket, each flake falling softly, just as her own days had passed, quietly, steadily, with little fanfare but plenty of meaning. In this town, she had built a life with Robert, a man who had been her anchor for so many years. Together, they had crafted their own version of stability. Their home was their fortress, not just of brick and mortar, but of shared dreams and long nights spent supporting one another through thick and thin. The house they had built was nothing grand, but it had always felt like everything. It stood as a symbol of their dedication to each other, their promises to persevere, and the love that had grown through decades of trials. There was no great wealth behind it, no inherited fortune to lean on, just hard work, and the quiet understanding that they would build their future from the ground up, piece by piece. From the very first day they had signed the mortgage papers, Harriet had known that this was not just Robert's house or her house, it was theirs, something they had built together from the ground up. The floors they walked on, the beams above their heads, each nail that held their world together had been driven by both of them. In their early years together, Robert was a man full of ambition, energy, and dreams. He worked long hours, trying to carve out a future that would provide for them both. But as life often does, it tossed challenges their way, failed ventures, financial setbacks, and unexpected burdens that threatened to tear at the seams of their world. It was during these trials that Harriet had become the silent strength in their home. While Robert's pride made it hard for him to ask for help, Harriet had always known when to step in. She had worked double shifts, picked up extra hours at the local clinic, and, when needed, cleaned houses for extra cash, all the while never once complaining. She did it for the man she loved, and for the life they had promised to build. Robert's strength had always been his quiet determination, but it was Harriet who held the family together, taking on burdens that Robert was too proud to share. She never voiced her fatigue or the weight of the responsibility that pressed down on her, because her priority was always Robert, and later, their son, Ethan. Ethan had been their joy, their light, from the moment he was born. Harriet had given him everything she had. She stayed up with him when he was sick, held him when he had his heart broken by a girl he barely knew, and fought tooth and nail for him when his teachers had been unjust. Every scraped knee, every late-night fever, every difficult moment, Harriet had been there. She had poured herself into being his mother, teaching him lessons of patience, kindness, and strength. And for all those years, she believed that Ethan would one day see the sacrifices she had made for him, the sleepless nights, the long hours at work, the sacrifices of her own happiness, all for his well-being. But Ethan, like all children, had grown, and as he grew, the distance between them began to widen. She had tried not to notice it. It was natural for children to separate themselves from their parents as they formed their own lives, but Harriet couldn't help but feel the subtle shift, the change in how Ethan no longer turned to her with the same trust, no longer shared the same small joys with her. He had a family of his own now, responsibilities that kept him preoccupied, and Harriet had never expected him to drop everything and come running to her every time she needed help. But it was the emotional distance that had hurt her the most, the small comments, the change in his voice when he spoke to her, the lack of consideration when he made decisions about family matters without consulting her. Despite the distance, Harriet had never stopped loving him. He was her son, the child she had brought into the world, the child who had once needed her in ways that now seemed like a distant memory. She had continued to quietly support him, even when it became clear that he no longer needed her as he once had. She continued to offer her advice, though it was rarely sought, and to support him, though it often went unnoticed. But as Robert's health began to decline, it was as though the weight of it all had suddenly shifted. What had once been a balanced life, one where Robert and Harriet worked together, one where they shared responsibility and effort, was now fraught with one-sided burdens. Robert, who had once been so strong, was now growing weaker by the day. His health failed him in ways Harriet had never expected. The man who had carried her over puddles and fixed their leaky roof with his own hands was no longer the same man. His illness took its toll, both physically and emotionally, and Harriet, the one who had always been there for Robert, was now his caretaker, his constant companion in a battle she knew they could not win. The weight of it was almost too much, but Harriet never allowed herself to acknowledge it, because, for her, there was no other choice but to endure. She continued to work, to care for Robert, to manage the household. She kept it together because there was no other option. But inside, the exhaustion, the quiet sadness, began to grow. She had always given so much of herself, and now, as Robert's health worsened, it felt as though she was being stretched thinner and thinner, her own needs slipping farther from her consciousness. And Ethan? Ethan came around less and less. When he did visit, it was often in hurried, half-hearted spurts. He had his own family, his own life, his own worries. Harriet understood this, of course. But there were moments, small moments, when she couldn't help but feel a pang of hurt. She had given him everything. And now, as she sat beside Robert's sickbed, she couldn't help but wonder if Ethan truly understood what she had done for him, for their family. In those quiet, lonely moments, Harriet would think back on all the years, all the sacrifices, all the ways she had kept things together. She never complained. She never asked for help. But she couldn't help but wonder, had it all been in vain? Had Ethan forgotten everything she had done for him? As she sat in the room with Robert, watching him slip further away with each passing day, the weight of those thoughts began to press on her more heavily. The house that they had built together, brick by brick, had once been a symbol of their love, their unity, and their family. But now, as she sat in the dim light of that same house, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She didn't expect Ethan to return to the house, not the way she had once imagined. But she had never expected him to turn on her either. She had never expected him to abandon her when she needed him most. And yet, that was exactly what he would do. The house had always been a sanctuary, a place where Robert and Harriet had weathered the storms of life, a place where memories were made and nurtured. The walls held echoes of laughter and love, the floors where they had danced, even if it was just in the kitchen to an old song they both loved. But when Robert passed away, the house, once filled with warmth, grew quiet. The air felt different, heavier, colder, as though the very heart of the home had stopped beating. Harriet, though grieving deeply, continued to be the woman who held everything together. Robert's death had shaken her to her core, but it did not break her. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the family she had once known. Ethan, her son, had grown up in that house, surrounded by love and sacrifice. She had raised him through hardships, and now, she had hoped that he would at least recognize the life she had given him. But when Ethan arrived at the house that morning, the look on his face was unfamiliar, his voice cold, devoid of the warmth she had always known. It was a moment that Harriet would replay in her mind for years to come, Ethan standing before her, his posture rigid, his eyes void of the affection she once saw in them. He spoke with a calculated finality, words that sent a chill through her heart. "This isn't your home anymore. Get out." The slap that followed was not the first time she had been struck in her life, but it was the first time it felt as though the very foundation of her identity had been shattered. The pain didn't come from the physical blow, but from the betrayal in Ethan's eyes, the one that pierced deeper than any hand ever could. In that moment, the house they had built together, the house that represented years of love, sacrifice, and shared history, was turned against her. It no longer felt like a home, but a battleground, where trust had been shattered and family ties severed. The betrayal Harriet felt was not just in the slap, but in Ethan's rejection of her very presence in the place she had helped create. She had spent years giving, nurturing, and protecting him, and now, it felt as if that had all been erased in an instant. Ethan's words, cold and unforgiving, stung far more than any physical slap ever could. Harriet stood there, numb, unable to react immediately. It was as if the weight of the moment had pressed the air from her lungs. She had always been strong, always the silent pillar of strength that kept the family standing, even when things seemed impossible. But this was different. This wasn't just a mother being rejected by her son, this was the slow, deliberate crumbling of everything she had fought to protect. The life she had built had been swept away by the same hands that had once been so small, so trusting. What hurt more than the words and the slap was the realization that Ethan's actions weren't just born from grief or anger, they were calculated. The emptiness in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Her presence in that house had never truly mattered to him. For years, she had been invisible to him, quietly filling the roles of caretaker, protector, and provider, while he slowly withdrew into his own life. Now, his wife, Sarah, stood behind him, her arms crossed in cold approval, her smirk barely hidden. Harriet had always known that Sarah had treated her like an outsider, a guest in her own home, but this was a new low. Sarah had remade the house, stripping it of its memories, repainting walls and changing rooms, as if Harriet's role in that home had never existed. It was as if they had erased her, as if the history she had shared with Robert, the sacrifices she had made, had no value. The physical slap was nothing compared to the emotional slap that followed, the one that left Harriet reeling, breathless, and betrayed. Her very presence, once cherished and loved, had become an inconvenience to Ethan and Sarah. The house, her home, was now nothing more than a stage for their new life, a life in which she no longer had a place. Harriet's response was not one of immediate anger or tears. She had seen that kind of reaction before, the quick bursts of emotion that never lasted, that only fueled the fire of chaos. No, Harriet's reaction was quieter, deeper. She had spent years absorbing the pain, the hurt, the quiet disappointments. She had learned that sometimes, the most powerful response was silence. In that silence, there was strength. And so, Harriet stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her mind racing through the memories of what she had built, and what she was about to lose. But she knew she would not lose everything. She had one thing that no one could take from her, not her son, not Sarah, not anyone. The house, the memories, the years of sacrifice, they no longer mattered. What mattered was what she had in her hands, an envelope with papers that would change everything. The mortgage, the deed, the papers that proved she was not just a guest in the home she had built but an equal, a co-owner. Robert had known this day might come. He had known that Ethan might one day forget what she had done for their family. And so, in one of their last conversations, he had quietly given her the documents, the backup will, the mortgage papers, and the clause that would ensure she was protected, no matter what. In that moment, Harriet made a choice. She would not let Ethan or Sarah rewrite the story of their family. She wouldn't raise her voice, nor would she plead for her place in the house. She simply took what was hers, her dignity, her strength, and that crucial piece of paper that would change everything. As she turned to walk out of the house, the air in her lungs felt lighter, though her heart ached with the weight of what had just happened. She had been discarded, rejected, betrayed by her own flesh and blood. But she would not be broken. The journey had only just begun. And while the house they had built together no longer felt like home, Harriet knew that she had something more powerful than any house, more lasting than any family's approval. She had herself. The days following the betrayal passed in a blur of cold silence. Harriet moved through them like a shadow, her mind locked in a single thought: what she would do next. The shock of Ethan's words and actions hadn't quite worn off, but the anger was quiet, controlled, buried deep beneath layers of something far more potent: resolve. She had been reduced to a mere visitor in the place she had built, but no longer. She was not without power. Not anymore. In the quiet after the storm, Harriet began to see the thread that ran through it all, the plan that Robert had set in motion long before his death. The papers he had quietly placed in her hands, the ones he had insisted she keep hidden away, were now her lifeline. As they sat on the dining table, the table where so many conversations had once taken place, the weight of their significance settled over her like a heavy coat. They weren't just legal documents. They were her shield. In the hushed moments of their final conversations, Robert had spoken in a voice thick with the knowing of what might come, even if she hadn't understood it fully at the time. "You must be prepared," he had said, his voice strained by illness, yet sharp with clarity. "If I go first, and when I go, you need to have something that ensures they can't erase you, Harriet. You can't let them." It had been an offhand comment, an unremarkable moment at the time. But now, the weight of his foresight pressed down on her. The papers he had left behind were not just words on a page. They were an inheritance of power. Her name on the mortgage wasn't just a footnote, it was a key to the home she had helped build. The backup will, tucked away in the safe deposit box, ensured that Ethan could not lay claim to everything Robert had worked for. But it was the clause, written by a lawyer, notarized, legal, that held everything together. It was simple, stark in its finality. If Ethan, or anyone else in the family, attempted to discard her, to erase her from the family history they had created together, they lost everything. She could still hear Robert's words in her mind, "Don't tell him about the documents, Harriet. Not unless he hurts you." She hadn't understood why he'd felt the need to say it, not until now. But now she did. And now she had something that would ensure her future, something she could hold on to in the face of everything that had just happened. The moment the documents were in her hands, Harriet made her first call. Not to Ethan, not to anyone in her family, but to the bank. She called them quietly, purposefully. She wasn't a grieving widow calling in desperation, begging for mercy. She wasn't even the woman who had spent years silently giving everything to her family, hoping for some shred of recognition. No, she was someone different now, someone with power. She called and requested that the automatic mortgage payments be stopped. The response from the bank was brief, but it was enough. "You're listed as a co-owner and co-borrower. You have the right to stop payments." Harriet's hands were steady as she listened to the confirmation, the validation of what she already knew. She wasn't just the mother, the widow, the quiet strength. She was, in the eyes of the law, an equal co-owner of the house. The power of silence began to settle deeper within her. It wasn't anger she felt anymore, it was something colder, something more controlled, independence. The realization struck her in waves. Ethan, who had dismissed her so easily, who thought the house was his to claim, had no idea what was coming. In his eyes, he had already won, had already taken what was his. But he was wrong. The house he thought was rightfully his was no longer his at all. The weight of this truth didn't bring her satisfaction, nor did it bring joy. It was simply the way things were. But it would be the moment that everything changed for him. The shock would come soon, when he realized that the house, the family's home, wasn't his inheritance. It was no longer a place of comfort, of ownership. It was now a symbol of his mistake, of the betrayal that he had committed against her. Harriet could almost see it, the day Ethan walked into that house, expecting to resume his life as it had been, expecting everything to fall back into place. The locks would be changed. The house would no longer be the home he thought was his. He would be faced with the reality that everything he had taken for granted was gone. And she would be the one to deliver that truth, not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of her rights. As the days passed, Harriet continued to move forward, not with the rashness of someone trying to reclaim what was taken from her, but with the steady, deliberate actions of a woman who had waited her whole life for this moment. She was building her case, not just legally, but emotionally. The papers in her possession were her foundation, but it was the silence, the control over her emotions, that would bring her the peace she had long been denied. Harriet wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for something more, the right to stand in her own life, on her own terms, without fear of being erased. The truth of it all settled on her like a cool breeze. She had always been the quiet one, the one who endured, the one who sacrificed. But now, she had a voice. She had her own story to tell. And she would tell it, not with words, but with actions. The documents, the bank's confirmation, the backup will, these were not just pieces of paper. They were her armor, and they would shield her from the forces that sought to diminish her. It was only a matter of time before Ethan would understand the true cost of his betrayal. And when he did, it wouldn't be her anger that spoke, it would be her silence. The weight of the decisions Harriet had made over the past few weeks began to settle into a quiet calm. The paperwork, the legal actions, the carefully calculated steps, each of them had brought her closer to reclaiming her peace, and now, they were finally coming to fruition. As the bank processed her request, her future became just a little clearer, the path forward more defined. The house, the place she had lived for so many years, was no longer hers to worry about, but neither was it Ethan's to claim. The mortgage payments had stopped, and the ownership had shifted in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. But Harriet didn't feel a rush of triumph. There was no exhilaration, no sense of victory. She had never been the kind of woman who craved the applause of others or the loud echoes of, "I told you so." The law was on her side, yes, but it wasn't about the legal victory. What mattered was the quiet assurance that she was no longer invisible. The house, once the symbol of a family's bond, a place she had sacrificed so much for, no longer defined her. In the weeks following the legal confirmation, Harriet moved swiftly. She didn't seek out a confrontation with Ethan, she had no desire to engage with the anger or frustration that would surely follow. She could already feel it, the space between her and the world she had once known was growing wider, not with bitterness, but with a sense of distance that felt strangely liberating. The house wasn't the only thing that had been sold. A part of her had been released in the process as well, as if the house had been a chain that held her to a past she no longer wished to carry. With the legal paperwork in order, Harriet took action. The estate, which had once been a symbol of family and belonging, would now go to something greater, something that could continue its purpose of providing shelter and peace for those who had been displaced, like her. The estate was now part of a designated trust for elderly women who, like Harriet, had faced the loss of a home, of security, of the life they thought would be theirs forever. The trust was more than just a legal matter, it was her statement, her small act of rebellion against the world that had tried to erase her. This was her victory, and it was quiet, not meant to be shared with anyone but herself. Harriet didn't need to announce her triumph. She didn't need to prove anything to Ethan or anyone else. The past, with its betrayals and its hurts, no longer had any hold over her. She didn't want to carry it with her into the future. And so, she moved. She moved, not in anger, not in revenge, but with a soft, quiet resolve to find peace in the life that was still hers to live. She bought a small cabin by a lake in Alaska, a place where the world felt wide and free, and where the past could no longer chase her. It wasn't a grand home. It didn't have the modern luxuries of a new house, nor the social currency of a place filled with visitors or attention. It was simply a small cabin, tucked away by the water, a refuge where Harriet could begin again, not from the ashes of betrayal, but from the strength of self-rediscovery. The cabin was humble, nestled away from the noise of the world, the kind of place where the wind would carry the scent of pine, and the lake surface would ripple with the soft movements of ducks. Harriet could sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the days unfold, feeling a quiet sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't running from her past, no, she wasn't running at all. She was choosing her own path, with no one to answer to but herself. As she settled into the rhythm of her new life, Harriet began to understand something she had never fully realized before. Healing wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about winning a battle or proving her worth to the world. Healing came from the decision to protect her peace, to guard it as fiercely as she had once guarded her family's well-being. In her quiet moments, by the lake, Harriet learned the true power of silence, not as a form of submission, but as a way of reclaiming the narrative of her own life. The house, the memories, the betrayal, none of it defined her anymore. She had built something far more important, a foundation of self-respect, a life that was hers, and hers alone. In her solitude, Harriet found strength she hadn't known was there. The years of being the silent pillar of her family had never broken her, but they had shaped her. And now, with no one to care for but herself, Harriet finally understood that she had been strong all along. She hadn't needed to be invisible, hadn't needed to disappear into the background of everyone else's lives. Her voice, her choices, her peace, these were hers to protect. It wasn't that the past had no impact on her, it was that she had learned how to put it to rest. The trauma of being discarded, of being treated as if she were nothing, had been deep. But over time, as the sun set over the Alaskan lake, Harriet found healing not in revenge or confrontation, but in the peace that came from simply living on her own terms. She knew that there would be no grand reunions, no heartfelt apologies from Ethan or Sarah. And she didn't need them. What she had now was far more valuable, a quiet life, free from the emotional weight of betrayal, a life where she was the author of her own story, and no one could take that away from her. The silence that had once been filled with sorrow and anger was now filled with peace. Harriet had learned, at last, that healing came not from forcing closure on others but from granting it to herself. And as the days passed, and the seasons shifted outside her cabin, Harriet knew that the future was hers to shape, with no one to answer to but the woman she had always been. The meeting had been arranged by Ethan and Sarah, their desperation evident even before they arrived. Harriet could see it in the hurried messages, the missed calls, and the trembling tone of Ethan's voice when he had finally reached her, pleading for a chance to speak, to explain, to fix everything. They had no idea, no real understanding of what they were walking into. To them, this was another chance to make things right, another chance to undo the mess they had created. But what they didn't realize was that the power had already shifted, the narrative had already changed, and Harriet was no longer the woman they thought they could control. When they arrived at her cabin, Ethan's face was clouded with a mix of guilt and frustration. Sarah, standing just behind him, had the same cold demeanor, but now, there was something else in her eyes, fear. They were both silent for a moment as Harriet opened the door, her presence alone a silent reminder of what they had lost. The cabin was small, peaceful, and entirely hers. It was everything they had failed to take from her, and now they stood before her, vulnerable. Ethan spoke first, his voice cracking under the weight of the guilt he had carried. "Mom," he started, pausing to swallow back the emotion that trembled in his voice. We didn't mean for it to get this far. I'm sorry. I was just angry, and Sarah, he faltered, his words stumbling over each other in an attempt to make sense of their actions, to put them back into a context that didn't hurt so much. Harriet didn't speak. She just watched him, the silence between them thick, dense. Her eyes, though steady and unflinching, spoke more than her words ever could. She had seen this before, the apologies, the pleas, the desperate attempts to fix something that had already been broken beyond repair. Ethan's apology, like so many before it, felt hollow, just words meant to absolve himself of the consequences he could no longer escape. "Mom, please," Ethan continued, his voice pleading now. "It's not too late. We can fix this. Just tell me what to do. We'll make it right. We never meant to hurt you. Please." His voice cracked again, a sob breaking through the thin veneer of control he had been holding on to. Harriet remained quiet. She had heard these words 1,000 times before, and now, they held no weight. She knew exactly what he was trying to do, he was trying to repair the damage without acknowledging the depth of the betrayal. But Harriet was no longer the woman who would accept empty promises. She was done being the silent one, the one who absorbed everything, kept quiet, and allowed others to rewrite the story of her life. Slowly, deliberately, Harriet reached for the folder on the table, her movements steady, as if the weight of what she was about to do wasn't even a question. She handed the folder to Ethan without a word. As he took it, his hands trembling, the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. The papers inside, the deed, the will, and the legal documents, told a story he hadn't been prepared for. Harriet's name was still on the mortgage. Her name was still on the deed. The house they had fought so hard to claim, the house they had stripped of its memories and rewritten with their own plans, was no longer theirs. It was never going to be theirs. He flipped through the documents, his face draining of color with each page he turned. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. The house was no longer his inheritance. It had already been sold. But what hurt most was where it had gone, into a trust for displaced seniors, a transitional home for women like Harriet, who had been discarded, just as she had been. The house, their so-called forever home, would now stand as a symbol of something greater, a refuge for women who had nowhere else to go. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their mistake settling over them like a heavy fog. Ethan looked at Harriet, his face a mixture of disbelief and panic. You sold it?" His voice was hoarse, a whisper of the anger and frustration that had once driven him. "You really did that?" Harriet didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The truth was clear in the way Ethan's shoulders slumped, the way he looked at the papers as though he were reading a script he had never been told. This was the price of his entitlement. This was the cost of his actions. For the first time, Ethan was forced to confront the reality of what he had lost, not just the house, not just the material things, but the respect and love of the woman who had always been there for him, who had sacrificed everything for him. But it wasn't just the house that he had lost, it was the opportunity to truly make amends, to understand the depth of the harm he had caused. And it was that truth that brought Ethan to his knees. His anger faded, replaced by something more raw, more vulnerable, regret. He let the papers fall to the floor, his hands shaking as he looked at Harriet, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. I didn't realize," he whispered, his voice cracking with shame. I thought it was mine. But it's not. It never was. I've lost everything." The silence that followed wasn't one of victory for Harriet. It wasn't about relishing in the downfall of her son. Instead, it was a silence filled with something else, something deeper than any words could express. Harriet had not only taken back what was rightfully hers, but she had also found something more valuable than any property or inheritance, her peace. And it was that peace that made her feel truly free. Ethan's realization was bitter and hard. The truth of their actions could not be undone. No amount of apologies, no more pleas, could erase the damage they had caused. But for Harriet, it wasn't about what they had taken. It wasn't about the house, the memories, or the betrayal. What mattered was that she had taken back her dignity. She had stood her ground, not with anger, but with quiet strength. She had not needed to shout or demand justice. She had simply taken what was hers, and in doing so, had reclaimed herself. As Ethan sat there, broken, the man who had once been her son, the one she had nurtured and fought for, now fully understood the price of his mistake. But it was too late. The past couldn't be rewritten. And for Harriet, this was no longer about seeking retribution. It was about the final, undeniable truth: she was free. Harriet sat in the quiet solitude of her cabin, the steady rhythm of her breath blending seamlessly with the sounds of nature outside. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant murmur of the lake's waves rolling gently onto the shore provided a calming backdrop to her thoughts. In this moment, in this place far from the life she had once known, she found a peace that she had never before experienced. There were no more expectations, no more people demanding her time or her energy. There was no more pretending to be something she was not, no more holding herself together for the sake of others. She thought about the years she had spent building her family's life, holding it all together like an invisible thread, weaving through the fabric of her existence. The sacrifices she had made, the sleepless nights, the quiet endurance, the years of giving without ever asking for anything in return. It had all led her to this point, to this moment of clarity. And yet, now that she was here, free from the expectations of others, she realized something profound: she had never truly known what it meant to be free. For so long, Harriet had carried the weight of everyone's hopes, dreams, and fears. She had quietly held everything together, never allowing the cracks to show, never letting anyone see how much she had given. But in the end, none of that mattered. The home, the memories, the material things, none of it defined her. What truly mattered was the quiet strength she had found within herself, the quiet resolve that had carried her through the darkest moments. The betrayal she had suffered, though painful, was a catalyst for change. It had opened her eyes to the fact that she had been invisible for far too long. She had given everything to people who had never truly seen her, and in doing so, had lost herself. But now, she was finally reclaiming her voice. She was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows, waiting to be acknowledged. She was the woman who stood tall, unshaken, even in the silence. Harriet's thoughts drifted back to the house, the place where everything had begun and everything had ended. She remembered the way it had once felt like home, the warmth of it, the love that had filled its walls. But now, it was just a house, a structure that had been sold, a place she had once called home but had long since outgrown. It was no longer hers, and yet it no longer had the power to define her. The truth was, the house had never been the most important thing. It had never been the place that held her together. It had been the people, the family, the relationships, but even those had faltered in ways she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. Now, Harriet realized that the true home she had been searching for was within herself. The home was not the walls, the furniture, or the memories of the past. The home was the quiet peace she had found in the cabin by the lake, where the only thing she needed to hold together was herself. And in that realization, Harriet found a sense of freedom she had never known. She was no longer bound by anyone else's expectations. She didn't have to carry the weight of other people's lives. She could finally live her own life, on her own terms, without fear of being erased. For the first time in a long time, Harriet knew what it meant to be truly free. In the silence of the cabin, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Harriet reflected on the journey she had taken. It had been a long road, one filled with pain, sacrifice, and betrayal. But it had also been a road of self-discovery, of finding the strength within herself to let go of the past and embrace the future. She had fought for her voice, for her independence, and now, in this moment of quiet, she had it. The house, the betrayal, even Ethan, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered now was that Harriet had found herself again. She had reclaimed her peace, her dignity, and her future. She was no longer invisible. She was standing in the light, finally able to breathe freely. The journey wasn't over. Harriet knew that. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to face. But she was ready. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, that healing didn't come from holding on to the past. It came from letting go and choosing to move forward. Harriet wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. As Harriet continues her journey, finding peace in the quiet of her own strength, we are reminded that true healing comes from within. No matter how difficult the path may be, the power to reclaim our lives is always within our reach. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of our journey together. And as always, take care of yourself and remember, your strength lies in the quiet moments, too. Stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next story.